Instead, we have the opportunity to make a habit of empathy, to recognize ourselves in each other.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. I would like to introduce Kristin Neff, who wrote Self-Compassion, which I hope everyone's excited about, because I am. I know that I am really hard on myself, and I know other people tend to be hard on themselves as well. So she'll be talking to us today about being kinder to ourselves, which I think we all deserve, because we're all nice to our friends when they're having a hard time.
And we're doing the best we can.
Exactly. So why shouldn't we be nicer to ourselves? I agree totally with her, so she'll be speaking about that today. We also have her books up front in case anybody's interested in getting one and having it signed by her at the end. And thank you.
So I'll try once more. If it's quiet and I speak loudly, is that okay, or do you want the mic? You want the mic? Okay, all right. I haven't got my Phil Donahue shtick quite down, but I'll learn it. All right. How's that? Is that good?
No.
No.
Hold it closer.
How's this? Ooh, okay. All right. All right, so let me give you a little background about how I got here, why I'm here. I actually got my PhD at UC Berkeley. I lived not that far from here, actually. And I was going through a really rough time in my life. I was getting over a very messy divorce, had a lot of feelings of shame, self-loathing, a lot of insecurity. I was finishing up my PhD, didn't know if I could do it, and if I did do it, would I get a job? It was just a very stressful time in my life. And I started practicing with a Buddhist meditation group, a local one actually. It was a Thich Nhat Hanh Sangha. And they talked a lot about the importance of compassion for others, of course, but also a lot about self-compassion. And it was exactly what I needed to hear at the time. It was like a light bulb went off over my head, and I thought, this is what I need. And it's funny, it took me a while to get the mindfulness meditation stuff. It took a while to get that, but I almost immediately understood the value of self-compassion and started applying it in my personal life. It really helped me through at a very difficult time. And then I managed to go ahead and get my PhD. And I did a 2-year postdoc with a woman who was one of the country's leading self-esteem researchers, because I was interested in self-concept, how people feel about themselves. And I started to realize while working with her that psychology was really falling out of love with self-esteem. That although it had certainly been an important marker of psychological health for a long time, there were also a lot of problems trying to get high self-esteem and trying to keep a high sense of high self-esteem that was problematic. So I'm going to start my journey there, and then we'll find our way to self-compassion. All right, so you all know there's probably lots of books in this store. There's been hundreds, thousands of books written about self-esteem, and for very good reason, because research shows that people who have high self-esteem tend to be happier, less depressed, they're more psychologically healthy. Those who hate themselves tend to have very low feelings of self-worth, and they're depressed, anxious, etc. So people assumed that what we needed to do then to make a happy, healthy populace was just raise everybody's self-esteem. So there was a whole movement in the schools. California was at the forefront, right? They actually spent tax dollars to raise the self-esteem of children. And again, coming from really good motives, trying to see if we could arm kids with a sense of high self-esteem, if they loved themselves, felt good about themselves, then they'd be more psychologically resilient as adults. Unfortunately, things didn't really turn out as well as people had hoped for, partly because there's a lot of hidden downsides to self-esteem. The problem is not with self-esteem itself. The problem is not feeling good about yourself. It's why do you feel good about yourself? Okay. So in our culture, to feel good about ourselves, we need to feel special and above average, right? And actually, the term for it, one term is the better than average effect, but the other term actually in the literature is the Lake Wobegon effect. The idea that everybody thinks they're better than average on almost any trait you throw at them, all right? So 97% of people think they're better drivers than others. Even people who've recently caused a car accident think they're better drivers than others. People think they're friendlier, nicer. People think they're more able to see themselves objectively than other people, right? And so what happens is, if we all need to be special and above average, we're always slightly trying to find ways in which you can be better than other people, right? Being average is an insult. And actually, I tell this story in my book, and I won't read it aloud, but my old roommate Kathy's here, and she was reminding me today of when I was in college. I was getting ready for a party, getting my makeup ready, and my hair and my outfit, and I was complaining to my boyfriend at the time, "Oh God, I just don't look good enough." And he said, "Don't worry, you look fine." And I said, "Fine? Oh great, I always wanted to look fine," right? It's like anyone here, if I said, "Oh, the outfit you're wearing is average," your work performance, like a student, "Yeah, that wasn't average, essay you wrote," you'd off yourself. So it's not okay to be average. We have to be above average, which means we can't really see ourselves clearly because, by definition, we are average, right? At least on some traits. All right. So this constant drive to feel better than other people has actually led in our culture right now, to an epidemic of narcissism. Okay, they've been tracking self-esteem levels and narcissism levels for about the last 20 years. And self-esteem has been rising steadily, and so has narcissism. So I don't know if any of you work with people in their early 20s, but it's actually the most narcissistic population of college undergraduates ever recorded. A lot of people are getting very worried about how entitled a lot of young people feel. Like they shouldn't have to work for anything, right? They are superior by definition. They deserve adulation, and they get very upset if they don't get the attention and adulation they think they deserve. It's funny, my son is just starting to get into pop music right now. So I'm listening to all these really horrible, like Justin Bieber type pop music songs. But so many of them, the lyrics, you think, oh my God, that's so narcissistic. How could you say that in public, let alone on a recording, So again, it's kind of like self-esteem has run amok. Okay, so we need too much to feel special and above average to the point where we feel superior. All right, so another way we get our self-esteem, if we're always having to say who's on top, who's on bottom, is social comparison. How many of you here saw the film Mean Girls? Quite a few of you. It's actually probably the best film on self-esteem ever made. It's based on an actual sociological study by Rosalind Wiseman, I think, called Queen Bees and Wannabes. So a sociologist went into a high school and just observed the people really carefully. What is it about the popular girls? Why are they popular? How do they keep their status? And they did things like keeping a burn book, which is basically keeping notes of really nasty comments about other people. Of course, this is a really dated film. It'll all be on Facebook now, right? But that thing of always kind of insulting people, putting them down, puffing yourself up in comparison, that is how some people get their high self-esteem. All right, so for a long time, people thought, oh, surely people who are bullies or people who are prejudiced, they must have low self-esteem. That's why they do it, right? Turns out that's actually not the case. So bullies, for instance, one of the ways they get their high self-esteem is by bullying other people. If I'm picking on you, the little weak kid in the corner, in that moment, I feel good about myself because I'm superior, I'm stronger, I'm cooler, whatever it is. And then you take that a step further to prejudice. Now, of course, I'm using the extreme example, the KKK, and we're probably all horrified. We can see how they think they're superior. But what if I replace that with donkeys and elephants, right? We're in Berkeley, I can guess which side would be seen as superior. But this idea of my group is better than yours, this getting your sense of self-worth from identifying with my group that's better than your group, leads to a lot of pretty nasty social dynamics. Ego defensiveness. Think about the last time you got in a really, knockdown fight with someone. Chances are your ego was involved in some way, right? So if someone says something to you or insinuates something that might slightly make you feel like, oh, that hurts my self-esteem, you're kind of, you dissing me, I guess would be the term, right? Often we react with anger and blame because it's much better to blame someone else for the problem and keep your self-esteem than have to admit, mea culpa, you're right, I did do it. And if you look at the posture of people who are angry, it's strong, your back straight. There's a sense of pride associated with defending your ego. And in fact, research is showing now that oftentimes people with very high self-esteem are angry more often than others, because that's one of the ways they're constantly defending their egos. And so probably one of the biggest problems with self-esteem in terms of how you get it is that it's not always, but typically contingent. In other words, if I value looking a certain way, I only feel good about myself when, I weigh a certain amount, or my hair has gone good that day, or, I'm wearing fashionable clothes, or if I value being good at athletics, maybe my self-esteem is I'm on top of the world the day I win, but then I come in, second. They actually say it's worse to come in second than third place, because with third place, you're like, oh, at least I got a medal. Second place, it's like, oh, I could have been number one, right? So your self-esteem goes up and down depending on how well you're doing lately. And what research, again, is starting to show now is that it's almost better to have low self-esteem that's constant, because at least you know what you're dealing with. But this constant going up and down, one day I'm on top of the world, next day I'm at the bottom of the heap, that instability is actually really psychologically damaging and causes a lot of emotional instability. What's the answer?
Self-compassion.
Yeah, self-compassion. All right, so this is going to be my first little reading. I'm going to intersperse this with reading so that hopefully you all march to the register and buy my book at the end. Okay. So can you hear me okay? Having contingent self-esteem can feel like Mr. Toad's wild ride, your mood swinging from elation one moment to devastation the next. Let's say you derive your sense of self-worth from doing well at your marketing job. You feel like a king when you're named salesperson of the month, but a pauper when your monthly sales figures are merely average. Or maybe you tend to base your self-esteem on being liked by others. You'll get an incredible high when you receive a nice compliment, but crash in the dust when someone ignores you or worse, criticizes you. Once I actually had the experience of feeling hugely complimented and devastatingly criticized at the exact same moment. Completely true story. I was visiting an equestrian center with my husband, Rupert, a lifelong horseman, and the elderly Spanish riding instructor who ran the stable apparently liked my dark Mediterranean looks. In his desire to be gallant, he paid me what he clearly thought was the highest compliment. "You are very beautiful. Don't ever shave your mustache." I'm like, He meant well, he really did. But, yeah, you can imagine. All right. Continually feeding our need for positive self-evaluation is a bit like stuffing ourselves with candy. We get a brief sugar high, then a crash. And right after the crash comes a pendulum swing to despair as we realize that however much we'd like to, we can't always blame our problems on someone else. We can't always feel special and above average, and the result is often devastating. We look in the mirror and don't like what we see, both literally and figuratively, and the shame starts to set in. Most of us are incredibly hard on ourselves when we finally admit some flaw or shortcoming. I'm not good enough. I'm worthless. It's not surprising that we hide the truth from ourselves when honesty is met with such harsh condemnation.
Louder.
Louder. Okay. Is there a way to turn this up? All right. So what's the answer? To stop judging and evaluating ourselves altogether. To stop trying to label ourselves as good or bad and simply accept ourselves with an open heart. To treat ourselves with the same kindness, caring, and compassion we would show to a good friend, or even a stranger for that matter. Sadly, however, there's almost no one who we treat as badly as ourselves. And I think a lot of us can recognize that it's true. If you think about the actual words we often use to ourselves, would you ever even tell a stranger on the street, would you ever use those words, you know? Let alone a child or a good friend, if we wanted to keep being their good friend, right? So we have this pattern of being very, very hard and self-critical, and we'll talk about it causes a lot of psychological pain. All right, so my field of research is on self-compassion, which basically means treating yourself with the same kindness and caring that you would show a friend. But when I first sat down I decided when I got my job at UT Austin, I wanted to do research on self-compassion. And at that point, no one had done any research on this topic. But a lot of people had written about it in other fields, non-academic fields, Buddhist scholars, etc. So what I did is I decided I wanted to define self-compassion and then measure it and then conduct research on it. So first I just read through every book I could get my hands on, books like Sharon Salzberg's Loving Kindness is a classic, to try to figure out, well, what is self-compassion exactly? And one of the first things I realized that self-compassion and compassion for others is really the same emotional experience. It just has a different target. Okay, so in the Buddhist perspective especially, this distinction between self and other is kind of an illusion. We're all part of this interdependent living whole. So it's easier to start understanding self-compassion by thinking about what it means to have compassion for others. So let's say you're walking down Telegraph Avenue or something, and you see a homeless woman, okay? So in order to have compassion for her, like what has to happen to feel compassion for her? First, you have to notice her suffering. If you're busy and you just walk right by her and you don't even take her in, you can't have compassion for her. So you have to, for whatever reason, one day you stop and you say, ooh, what's her story? You know, this must be really hard. She's homeless. She's an old lady. How did she get there? Okay. And then so you notice her suffering, and then if you feel compassion as opposed to maybe being irritated, let's say, you feel moved by her suffering. Your heart opens. You feel a sense of caring concern for her. You know, oh, that must be so hard, poor thing. And you feel moved in some way to alleviate her suffering. Doesn't mean you'll necessarily give her money if you think that's not responsible, but the urge to help her arises. And then lastly, in order for it to be compassion and not pity, you know, that poor lady over there has to be a sense of common humanity. There but for the grace of God go I. She's a human being, I'm a human being, we're all vulnerable. Okay? So those are the three components I argue also constitute self-compassion. Okay, so the first component of self-compassion is self-kindness versus harsh self-judgment. In some ways, this is the most obvious aspect of self-compassion. Treating yourself with support, caring, gentleness, understanding, as opposed to always being either callous or very hard on yourself. And I want to give you a little taste of what this feels like. I'm going to put this down for a second and just speak loudly. All right. Everyone, stick your hands out. If you can't do it to your side, in front of you somewhere, out. All right. And clasp your fists really hard. Okay, and hold them there for like 5 seconds. Okay, this is what self-judgment feels like, right? Tight, unpleasant, painful. You're all, you know, stressed out, really. And then release your hands and let them open. Okay, this is what letting go of self-judgment feels like. A lot more freedom, a lot more space, a lot less tension. But now take your hands and place them gently over your heart with a lot of warmth and tenderness. Just let yourself feel that for a second. And that's what self-kindness feels like. There's an active, soothing quality to it that actually lets you feel calm, safe, secure. And a little bit later, I'll talk about why there's a physiological reason you have that response. Okay, so again, self-kindness is more than not judging yourself. It's actively comforting yourself. Okay. All right, so again, another essential aspect, just like with self-compassion, with compassion for others, is the sense of common humanity. All right, remembering that imperfection is part of the shared human experience. Everybody is imperfect. Everyone has difficulties happen. Oftentimes when things go wrong, you make a mistake, or I don't know, you lose your job, something goes wrong. Irrationally, it feels like this is not supposed to be happening. You know, what has gone wrong? And that feeling of resistance about the fact that something's gone wrong, like, this isn't the plan I signed up for. I signed the I will be perfect, life will be perfect contract, and I want my money back. We feel really upset by the fact that things have gone wrong, when in fact that is normal. That is the plan we signed up for. What happens though, when you have that reaction of feeling this is not supposed to be happening, this is abnormal, is we feel isolated in our suffering. We feel all alone. And some of our research shows that it's that feeling of isolation, of being cut off, of being separated from everyone else when something goes wrong in your life, that's actually some of the most psychologically painful. So again, remembering. Instead of feeling isolated by suffering, remembering that we're all in it together. All right. And then the last component is mindfulness. And there's been a lot of talk and research about mindfulness lately. Mindfulness, in a very small little nutshell, is being with things as they are in the present moment. Okay, so seeing things clearly, acknowledging the emotions and thoughts that are arising, not suppressing them, not avoiding them. On the other hand, not running away with them, getting lost in a dramatic storyline of thought and overreaction. Okay, so it's just being with things as they are. And again, we need that for self-compassion, because we can't give ourselves compassion unless we're mindfully aware of our suffering. A lot of people say, well, suffering, duh, don't I know when I suffer? It's pretty obvious. In fact, it's really often not very obvious. First of all, probably our most intense suffering comes from our own self-criticism. And so when we're lost in barraging ourselves with self-judgment, we often don't stop to take the other perspective and say, wow, this is really hard, this really hurts. I can't believe I'm hearing these things from myself. Okay? So we don't actually step outside ourselves long enough to realize the intense suffering we're causing ourselves. But even if the suffering isn't from our own self-criticism, maybe you just got rear-ended on the freeway, it's terrible, there's traffic stop, you've got to figure out a tow truck, etc. It's really stressful. We often go straight into problem-solving mode. Get on the phone, figure out what you need to do, and maybe for the next few days, you just focus on problem-solving. But we often don't stop to pause to remember that, this is really difficult. I am suffering. I need some compassionate care. We kind of just gloss over our own. I'm sure that will be. All right, we can ignore it for now. We just gloss over things and keep on focusing on problem solving, and you can't really give yourself the compassion you need in problem solving mode. Let's pause for 1 second. It's all right.
You should use the
Oh, I know, it's just amplified. Oh well, let's go forward. So so the aspect of mindfulness is really important, not only because we have to remember our suffering to give ourselves compassion, but also one of the reasons people say they don't want to be self-compassionate is they think it's self-pity. Okay, it's a really common confusion, and I think in our culture, the idea of stoicism and just stiff upper lip, grin and bear it, is there because we think self-compassion is self-pity. Very important to remember that self-compassion is not self-pity. First of all, self-pity is egocentric. Why is it so annoying when someone's lost in self-pity? They're on their own drama, poor me, woe is me, often really getting lost in the dramatic storyline of their own soap opera. They aren't saying, self-compassion is, the human condition entails suffering. I'm hurting, but you're hurting, and we're all in this together. Self-pity is very self-focused, so it's really something very, very different. Okay, we do my next reading. Maybe I'll sit, and therefore I can read and use the mic at the same time. All right. When we give ourselves compassion, we are opening our hearts in a way that transforms our lives. But what does it mean to be open-hearted? It's a phrase we use all the time, but what does it actually mean? Open-heartedness is a state of emotional receptivity in which even unpleasant or negative experiences are held with caring concern. When we kiss the boo-boo on a child's hurt finger, or listen empathetically to a dear friend telling us their woes, when we feel compassion, in other words, we experience an inner warmth spreading out from the center of our chest. And this feeling is what lets us know that our hearts are open. And how does it feel to have an open heart? Pretty damn good. When compassion is flowing through our veins, we feel at our vibrant best, connected, alive, plugged in. When we unlock our hearts, new experiences are free to emerge. Experience of love, courage, and unlimited possibility. This means that hidden within every moment of anguish lies the potential for contentment. Pain can become the doorway to happiness because feeling loved, cared for, and connected is what truly makes us happy. So you might say, yeah, I'm sold. You know, you guys live in Berkeley, you're sold, right? Why isn't the culture more compassionate? It's not a term you hear very much. It is starting to come into common parlance lately. I must say, not that I took personal credit, maybe a wee bit of personal credit. Lady Gaga the other day was talking about self-compassion. So, just mention my book, you know. But anyway, but you know, it's starting to get out there a little bit, but it's really very, very new to even have the term in our culture. So it's worth asking the question: why isn't that a common concept? So I talked a little bit about one, confusion with self-pity. I think I'll let you guess which one is promoted in American culture in terms of, especially among men, right? So it's kind of hearts and flowersy, you know, self-compassion. Ooh, it's kind of gooey and sticky. I think there's that reaction. But I tell you, once you show someone's brain on self-compassion, all of a sudden it's not hearts and flowers anymore. They're starting to do this fMRI, showing up what parts of the brain light up on self-compassion. I don't have a photo here. But so now it's starting to become credible because we've got brain images. All right. This is, I think, maybe the #1 reason, or this and a couple I'm going to show you, is confusion with self-indulgence. Oftentimes, especially if I'm maybe lecturing to a group of undergraduates about self-compassion, have a little hand go up and say, excuse me, Professor Neff, can't you be too self-compassionate? And I think what they're asking basically is, if I'm too self-compassionate, won't I let myself get away with anything, right? And you know, there was a great New York Times article on this research a few months ago, but the problem was she titled it, "Go Easy on Yourself." And I'm like, oh, you just fed into the misconception, right? Self-compassion is not just going easy on yourself and being self-indulgent. So if you start being more self-compassionate, you aren't going to skip work, watch TV reruns all day, and eat ice cream. You know, why not? Because compassion is concerned with the alleviation of suffering. Compassion wants health, healing, not to cause suffering. If you skip work and eat ice cream all day, you're going to cause yourself suffering, and that's the opposite of what compassion for self or others want. It's very easy to see with good parents. A good, compassionate, caring parent doesn't let her kids skip school watching TV and eating all day, right? You know, she said, eat your vegetables, do your homework, you know, go to bed by a certain hour. In order to be healthy, we can't let ourselves do anything, any sort of pleasurable act we want in the moment. And with self-compassion, it's the same. Related to this is making excuses, right? The dog ate my homework. Now that's the light form, but you know, a lot of people really quite seriously, they think, well, what if I have done something really wrong? What if I've really hurt someone or done something I'm really ashamed of? If I just say, oh, I'm only human, aren't I just blowing it off, letting myself off the hook? Okay? No, because it's actually quite the opposite. Self-compassion gives you the emotional safety and courage needed to see yourself clearly. If you're invested in protecting your self-esteem, you'll either do one of two things. You'll try as hard as you can to deny responsibility or blame it on someone else. Or if at some point you can't do that anymore and you just barrage yourself with self-criticism, you're going to become very, shame is a very ego-focused emotion. Shame is all about, poor me, I'm so worthless, I'm so terrible. It's not really focused on fixing what you did wrong. What the research shows is that people who are self-compassionate are more likely to take responsibility for their mistakes. They're also more likely to feel guilt rather than shame. And in psychology, the distinction is, guilt is about, I am so sorry. What can I do to fix things or make it up to you? Shame is, I'm so terrible, I'm so worthless. So one is other focus, the other one is self-focus. So self-compassion allows you to, if you have done something really wrong, to admit it, own up to it, do what you can to repair the situation, precisely because you've had the emotional courage to see yourself clearly. It's a beautiful quote by Carl Rogers. The curious paradox is that when I accept myself just as I am, then I can change, right? So if we don't accept ourselves and we don't really admit what we're like, and we're trying to be some ideal that doesn't have anything to do with us, we're kind of hamstrung. But as soon as we say, this is who I am, I'm exactly okay the way I am, but these are the ways in which I'm unhappy, and these are the ways in which I'd like to heal. Again, having that sense of self-acceptance and safety, which self-compassion provides, allows you to make those changes. But there still might be a few holdouts saying, but wait a second, don't we need self-criticism to motivate ourselves? It's funny, we're really attached to our whips, our self-flagellation. We know it's painful, we know it's not good, but surely it must be effective, right? If I put it down, maybe I'm not going to sit around watching TV all day eating ice cream, but I'm not going to go and achieve my goals and climb mountains. Read my book and you'll see, but the research says no, absolutely the opposite is true, and here's why. What does self-criticism do? First of all, there's a very strong relationship between self-criticism and depression. Basically, if you criticize yourself a lot, you will be depressed. And there's some physiological reasons for that as well as just the fact that it's a real bummer to be criticizing yourself all the time. Depression is antithetical to motivation, right? It's not like, yeah, I'm going to go climb that mountain. I feel so depressed today, right? It really works against motivation. The other thing self-criticism does is it lowers what's called self-efficacy beliefs, basically your self-confidence. If you're constantly tearing yourself down, you're not going to believe in yourself. Again, people who study motivation find that probably maybe one of the single most important factors for who succeeds and who doesn't is how much self-confidence they have, how much they believe in themselves. So you're kind of pulling the rug out from underneath yourself when you're constantly criticizing yourself. The other thing is fear of failure. If you criticize yourself a lot, you're going to be afraid of failure because oh my God, if I fail, it's going to be terrible. I'm going to say all these terrible things to myself. So a lot of self-critics do what's called self-handicapping strategies. Taking the easy A course as opposed to challenging yourself. Procrastinating. So therefore, if you don't do well, you can say, oh, it's just because I didn't study till the last minute or something like that. So self-criticism works against motivation, whereas self-compassion, on the other hand, is really interested in this research now, but doing more and more research showing that it's strongly associated with being motivated, being intrinsically motivated, trying to reach your highest potential. When you fail at a goal, actually getting up and picking yourself up and trying again. And once again, I think it's really easy to see why we think of how a parent motivates their child. So let's say this man is his son Johnny comes home from school with a failing grade in math. Okay, there's two approaches. One is, you are so stupid and lazy, you will never amount to anything. I'm so ashamed of you. And you cringe, don't you? But isn't that what we often say to ourselves? Is that going to work for Johnny? Is that going to make him try harder? Of course not. If the father wants to motivate his son, he'll say, this grade's a problem. I know you want to get into college. We need to get your grades up, but I believe in you. I know you can do it. Let's figure out what happened. Maybe you need a new study routine. Maybe we need to hire a tutor. I don't know, but I'm here for you, and I believe in you. That type of supportive, compassionate message is going to be a much more effective motivator than telling Johnny he's worthless. And yet, for some reason, it's so easy to see with kids, but so hard to see with ourselves. So maybe next time if you catch yourself, beating yourself up, think about that. What if you said that to a friend, or what if you said that to your child? Is that going to help them? What's that going to do to them? All right. I'm just going to go a little bit over the research. I don't want to bore you with it. Actually, I've got a website where pretty much any article ever published on self-compassion is on my website. So if you're an academic type, it's all there, easily available. Just maybe as a little background, when I started looking at self-compassion, no one had done any empirical research on it. So I thought, okay, well, how am I going to research this thing that I'm so excited about? I know I'll create a scale to measure it. It's kind of a good starting place. So I created the self-compassion scale, which is a self-report measure that describes, are you kind to yourself when you mess up, or do you beat yourself up, do you feel isolated, etc. And it's worked out pretty well. And so for the first maybe 5 years, almost all the research on self-compassion was done with the scale. And now we're starting to use other methods like telling people to be more self-compassionate and seeing how they behave, or even training them to be more self-compassionate and see how that changes. And again, it's really exciting, especially for me, because the first couple years there was just, a couple studies, and I wrote them, and I felt like I was all alone out there, and it's kind of growing. And so the last year, there's been 40 published dissertations or journal articles on self-compassion. It's kind of exponentially rising, which is really exciting because a lot of people are just coming up with all these amazing ideas. So we'll just see what happens. But just in a nutshell, really strong associations with all the good things you'd want: life satisfaction, connectedness, wisdom, coping, personal growth, curiosity, happiness. There was just a study that came out a few weeks ago showing that self-compassionate people are actually more creative. Somehow it frees up mental space to be creative. Probably one of the most strongest and stable negative findings we have is that self-compassion is associated with less anxiety. The two are so close that you'd almost think they're the same thing if they didn't look so different on the surface. A really strong negative correlation. Fear of failure, body shame is something people are starting to look at. A lot of body image issues in our culture, that teaching young women to have self-compassion helps them to accept their bodies as they are. Another interesting area is PTSD. There's actually several people now working with vets coming back from the Afghan or Iraq wars, using self-compassion to help them with their PTSD symptoms. Seems to be very, very promising, especially because there's just so much pain associated with that. Some interesting new studies coming out on health behaviors. So people who are more self-compassionate, who are trained to be more self-compassionate, are more likely to exercise, but for the right reasons. To exercise not because they feel they need to, but because they want to be healthy. There's actually some fun research showing that people who are on diets, who are told to be more self-compassionate when they blow their diet, which is an inevitability at some point, that they're more likely to stick to their diets. What happens if you beat yourself up when you blow your diet is you feel so bad about blowing your diet that you tend to overeat to comfort yourself for blowing your diet, right? So being self-compassionate helps people keep on track with their goals. It's helping people reduce smoking, especially people who are strong self-critics. That you can't guess what the Trojan there is for, right? People who practice safer sex when they're self-compassionate. And also they're more likely to go visit the doctor when they have physical symptoms. So in other words, this self-compassionate attitude also seems to be translating into healthy behaviors in real life as well. All right, so switching gears a little bit, I want to talk about what's happening physiologically with self-compassion, because I said there's a reason why our bodies react a certain way, let's say when we touch our hearts, etc. Paul Gilbert, a man in the UK, writes a lot about this issue, and he says that self-esteem, self-criticism, and self-compassion, the three things we've been talking about here, these are all natural behaviors that we have developed through evolution as have different aspects of survival built into them. So self-esteem is all about the social rank system. We are pack animals, right? If you look at the apes, they tend to sort themselves out in hierarchies. So our bodies are driven to be alpha, because if we're alpha, we have more access to food, to mates, etc. And when we're number one, when we win, our body gets flooded with dopamine, which is like that yes feeling. When people win a race, they aren't like, yeah, cool. They're like, yes. That's dopamine. It's like really energizing. It's probably what Joke Cola wants to try to mimic. Okay, so that's what happens with self-esteem. And then with self-criticism, yes, self-criticism is all tied up with the threat-defense system, which is even an older system evolutionarily. So the idea is, when we are attacking or under attack, our amygdala gets activated, we release cortisol and adrenaline, which is like stress and run for your life. And if you think about it with self-criticism, it's a double whammy because we're both the attacker and the attacked. So when we have a lot of self-criticism, our body gets flooded with cortisol, which is the stress hormone, and that's why people are depressed, anxious, and stressed when they criticize themselves a lot. Luckily, the story doesn't end there. We're also mammals, okay? So all mammals, what makes them different from reptiles, for instance, is the mammalian caregiving system. The idea that, and the reason the young of mammals don't run off into the wild and get eaten by crocodiles is because they want to stay near the mother, and the mother wants to nurture the child. She doesn't kick them out. So we have this whole physiological system where when we give or receive care and warmth, our body gets flooded with oxytocin and other opiates. And these are the feel-good, I feel safe hormones. Just in case any of you are interested, the drug MDMA was designed to mimic oxytocin. Okay, that feeling of everything's safe, everything's wonderful, I love you, you love me. That's really what oxytocin does. Okay, so sometimes people say, I don't think I can be self-compassionate. I say, well, if you're a mammal, you've got a pretty good chance. It's built into your system. And in fact, some of you may have felt that a little bit. I really encourage people to practice compassionate touch, to put your hands over your hearts, or even give yourself a gentle squeeze. Because if you pay attention, you can feel this soft, warm feeling and this kind of gentling, softening feeling. And what the research shows is, again, your cortisol levels lower when you do that, or when you just think of a compassionate, feeling towards yourself. Your cortisol levels lower, your oxytocin raises, and you feel safe and secure. All right. Another reading. One of the reasons I like to emphasize the whole physiological underpinnings of this, besides the fact that there are cool pictures associated with it, is it really helps us remember that all this is natural, right? Yeah, all right. It's natural to want to have high self-esteem. It's natural to criticize ourselves. Luckily, it's also natural to be able to comfort and soothe ourselves, okay? Although it's important for us to see our psychological patterns clearly, it's equally important that we do not judge ourselves for them. If you're a habitual self-critic, remember that your behavior actually represents a convoluted form of self-care, an attempt to keep yourself safe and on track. You don't want to beat yourself up for beating yourself up in the vain hope that somehow it will make you stop beating yourself up. Just as hate can't conquer hate, but only strengthens and reinforces it, self-judgment can't stop self-judgment. The best way to counteract self-criticism, therefore, is to understand it, have compassion for it, and then replace it with a kinder response. By letting ourselves be moved by the suffering we've experienced at the hands of our own self-criticism, we strengthen our desire to heal. And eventually, after banging our heads against the wall long enough, we'll decide that enough is enough and demand an end to our self-inflicted pain. And who wants to be stuck in a box labeled good anyway? Isn't it more interesting to revel in the full range of human experience? Instead of trying to control ourselves and our lives to obtain a perfectionistic ideal, why not embrace life as it is, both the light and the shadow? What adventures might follow if we free ourselves in this way? Happiness is found when we go with the flow of life, not when we rail against it. And self-compassion can help us navigate these turbulent rapids with a wise, accepting heart. All right, so it's important in talking about the strengths of self-compassion and the power of self-compassion, which is all very true. It's also important to realize that some of us come by our lack of self-compassion, very honestly, you might say. And it's important to know where your habitual way of treating yourself comes from, because for some people it needs to be taken a little more, the path needs to be taken a little more gently than others. All right, so what we find in our research, just looking at the general population, basically college undergraduates largely, there is naturally occurring variation in self-compassion, and it seems to be, to some extent, associated with how you were treated by your parents when you were young, not surprisingly perhaps. So kids who had very critical parents growing up tend to be critical towards themselves. We internalize the voices we hear. Actually, sometimes when I have people, I say, why don't you just write down verbatim what you say to yourself? And they say, that's what Aunt Edna used to say to me, or something like that, right? You hear the voice inside your own head that you experienced earlier on. Also people who grew up in families where there was a lot of arguments, fighting, a lot of conflict, a lot of harsh words. And also people who weren't securely attached, whose parents weren't there for them, didn't support them, that they couldn't rely on for comfort and care. So if you were lucky enough to have a good, supportive, upbringing, you probably are hopefully more self-compassionate than most. Not necessarily. There's other cultural pressures. But if you are someone, or if you know someone who had a very, very harsh upbringing, was abused emotionally, physically, sexually, we actually have to always say, if that does describe you or someone you know, you need to go slowly, because there's a phenomenon known as backdraft. Okay? The idea that if you've had to keep your heart shut for a very good reason to protect yourself, and if feelings of compassion are kind of intermixed, interwoven, the people who should have cared for you were also the ones who harmed you, it can actually be really scary to start experiencing self-compassion. So I usually tell people, if this does describe you, or if you find yourself getting overwhelmed, like you start opening your heart to yourself and it just feels overwhelmingly scary, to go down the path with the help of a therapist. More and more therapists are starting to incorporate this in their practice. So that's kind of just something to be aware of. You wouldn't want everyone to just immediately jump into self-compassion, especially if they had a lot of trauma. You've got to be compassionate about how much compassion you give yourself. And actually, that's actually a good point, in that sometimes, although ultimately we want to be able to turn towards our suffering and hold it and embrace it and give it kindness and care and compassion, if it is overwhelming, it's good to step back a little bit. The idea is you should be able to choose when you dive into the pain and when you avoid it. You can avoid it mindfully, it's too much for me right now, or you can avoid it because I just can't face it. So it's about trying to approach your emotions in a healthy way, consciously, in a way that's not going to harm you in any way. All right. So I'm really interested in trying to bring the message of self-compassion to caregivers. Luckily, there has been an increasing amount of work by people trying to teach self-care practices to caregivers. The idea is that if you give and you give and you give to other people and don't replenish your own batteries, you are going to burn out. And in fact, this pattern is much more common than I had even realized. When I first started researching this, I thought, well, surely if you're really compassionate to yourself, you're going to be more compassionate to other people than those who beat themselves up. It's actually not what we find, and that's because there are so many people who are lovely, kind, caring, giving people, outwardly to other people, and who are terrible to themselves. It's almost like there's no association. I have to say it's a little more common among women. Women in general are a little more compassionate to others than men are, and they're a little less self-compassionate than men are. Okay? So the difference is that self-compassionate people are equally kind to themselves and others. People who are hard on themselves tend to be a lot kinder to others than themselves. So that, and that can work for a while, except that if you're a caregiver and if the demands on you are very strong, you will burn out. You will suffer compassion fatigue. And people who do have higher levels of self-compassion are able to not suffer as much compassion fatigue and burnout, and also take a lot more joy in their caregiving role, because they're actually stepping back and honoring, this is really hard. It's very, very stressful to be a caregiver oftentimes, and you need to be able to admit how hard it is and have compassion for that. And so actually I'm going to show a little clip of a film, but before I do that, just to give you a little background, my zeal for self-compassion isn't just an academic, theoretical thing. Not only did it help me at the time I first learned about it, but I have a son who's autistic, and he was diagnosed with autism about, 5 or 6 years ago now. And by that time, I'd already had a really well-established self-compassion practice. And I can tell you it saved my life. If I didn't give myself permission to immediately give myself compassion, dealing with the grief of the diagnosis, for instance. The day we got diagnosed, I was headed out on a meditation retreat, and I told my husband, cancel it, we just got to deal with this. And he said, no, I need you to go and sit with this compassionately so you can come back and be strong for me. So I never went through that period that it's pretty common of just denying my grief. I know a lot of autism parents and other parents with special needs kids, you almost feel guilty grieving about your child. I mean, this is your child, you love them. How can you feel grief? How can you feel shame? But the thing is you do. So being able to acknowledge that and hold that, not judge yourself for it, to give yourself compassion for what you're going through, it can really transform things so that you don't shut yourself down, you don't shut your emotions down when you're with your child, but you actually open to your child in a way that can lead to a lot of new experiences emerging. And I will say that as a segue I'm going to show a little film clip. I don't know, some of you may have heard of a book called The Horse Boy and a documentary made about, my husband wrote the book. It was about a journey our family made to Mongolia with our autistic son in search of healing. So I'm going to show a clip and talk a bit about, how self-compassion was really integral to our ability to open in that way.
In April 2004, my son Rowan was diagnosed with autism. The feeling was like being hit across the face with a baseball bat. Our lives became clogged under a mountain of conflicting information on the disorder. We tried everything. He didn't speak to us. One day, he ran away from me and ran right up to a horse called Betsy. The moment I put Rowan on Betsy's back, he began to speak.
He's a nice horse.
As Rowan began to open up to me for the first time, a light bulb went on in my head. Was there a place on Earth that combined healing with horses? Mongolia. This is a story about how, as a family, we did something crazy. How we ended up going halfway across the world in search of a miracle.
It wasn't exactly Ron's vision of Mongolia.
We're going to go up a several thousand-foot mountain and perform 4-hour ritual shamans. Isn't that what all families do? Sometimes I think he's like leaping forward, and sometimes it's like he's totally reversing. I couldn't help wondering, did I really have his best interest at heart here?
I don't know how useful it is to think of us as normal and Rowan as the sick one.
And then something happened. Rowan began laughing, giggling. We were together again as a family. His autism forced me to listen to what interested him above all else. We're onto something good here.
And I'm going to read a little bit more about how self-compassion helped me in the moment when Rowan would really lose it. But there's just this larger picture I hope I can portray of this strong transformational quality about self-compassion. I think what it is, the truth is the glass is both half empty and half full. Oftentimes we try to be positive thinkers. Let's, just think about the positive. It's very hard to do because a man named Rick Hansen says the mind is like Velcro for the negative and Teflon for the positive. Our brains like to stick on negativity, and that's because evolutionarily, if we focus on negative information, it helped us survive. So we're either stuck in the glass that's half empty, or we're trying so hard to think about the glass that's half full. But the fact is it's both. Life is full of suffering and joy. They're both always present simultaneously. So what happens with self-compassion is we're able to turn towards the suffering, not resist it, which actually exacerbates it and makes it feel stronger. We open to it. We aren't changing it. We're accepting our imperfection. We're accepting the imperfection of life. We're accepting that difficult things happen. And yet we're adding to that experience this beautifully positive feeling of love and connectedness. So sometimes the metaphor used for it is bittersweet chocolate. or semi-sweet chocolate. You know, milk sugar chocolate's too sweet. The really bitter stuff is too bitter. You get that blend of light and dark. It's so rich, it's so fulfilling, because that's what life actually is opening to all of our experiences. And it seems once you open, and you aren't trying to control things and say, I want my son to be this way, or I want to be this way, and you just open to it with an open heart, then amazing things can happen. Like, you know, this trip to Mongolia, and our son is just doing fabulously now. He's just really very little to complain about other than my husband Rupert. Myself. All right, so let me just read this last bit from the book, and then I'm going to open it up to questions. I can tell you from first-hand experience what a lifesaver self-compassion can be. It pulled me back from the precipice of despair over and over again as I struggled to deal with Rowan's autism. When my mind would start to walk down the dark alley of fear, what's going to happen to him? Will he ever live independently? Will he ever have a job, a family? I would try to stay in the present moment. I am right here, right now. Rowan is safe and happy. I have no idea what's going to happen to him or what his future holds. It's a mystery. But running away with my fear is not going to help. Let me focus on calming and comforting myself right now. Poor darling, I know how incredibly difficult it is for you. When I soothed my troubled mind with this kind of caring concern, I was able to stay centered without being overwhelmed, realizing that whatever Rowan's future held, I loved him exactly as he was. When people gave me disapproving looks in the grocery store because they assumed Rowan was a spoiled brat and that I was a bad mother for not being able to control his behavior, one autism mother actually said a stranger came up and slapped her child because he needed some real discipline. I would send myself compassion. I would hold my feelings of pain in mindful spatial awareness so that they didn't overwhelm me. Rowan's autism forced me to surrender any pretense of control, and mindfulness taught me that maybe this wasn't such a bad thing. No matter how much I wanted to be off that airplane, trapped 20,000 feet in the air as Rowan screamed away, every other passenger looking at us like they wished we were dead, having to run to the bathroom, which is occupied of course, to change Rowan's poop-filled underpants, I had no other choice but to deal with it. No other choice. All I could do was try to get through the situation with as much grace as I could muster. But once I surrendered, a deep sense of calm descended, and I felt a quiet joy knowing that my peace of mind didn't depend on external circumstances. If I could get through this moment, I could get through anything. Self-compassion helped me steer clear of anger and self-pity, allowing me to remain patient and loving toward Rowan despite the feelings of despair and frustration that would inevitably arise. And I'm not saying that I didn't have times when I lost it. I had many. But in those times, I still had my practice of self-compassion to fall back on. I could forgive myself for reacting badly, for making mistakes, for being human. If I hadn't been aware of the power of self-compassion at that time, I don't know how I would have gotten through those especially difficult early years. And for that reason, I'll always be eternally grateful, knowing that the angel of self-compassion sits on my shoulder, available whenever I need it. So, any questions? I think she came first. The lady in the back with the purple shirt, you?
This might seem like a weird question. I don't know if your book addresses it or not, so I haven't read it. Is there anything to suggest that people who are sort of very self-critical, lacking in self-compassion, do they also attract criticism from others? Is there any sort of...
Okay, so do people who are self-critical, do they attract more criticism from others? I would be surprised if someone hadn't looked at that. I do know that people who are have very low self-concept and beat themselves up a lot, they tend to be attracted to other people who will treat them like they deserve to be attracted. So I assume that must be reciprocal because they tend to be able to find partners. So absolutely, if you feel like you deserve criticism and that you aren't worthy, you're going to seek out a mate who treats you the way you think you deserve to be treated. And that's actually a very, very powerful problem, and why self-compassion, the lack of self-compassion, can mean you keep choosing the wrong relationship. It's interesting. I haven't really considered from the others, like what would cause that person to be attracted to the self-critic, but maybe they can feel superior in comparison. It's probably something like that.
Yeah. That does make a certain amount of sense.
It does.
I just was sort of curious about in the larger context of it, besides just intimate partners, if there's somehow, people are sending out some sort of signal to say, I'm available to be kicked, or to go to say,
Yeah, that's interesting. I'd be lying if I said I knew exactly the answer, but I know research has been done on that in general, so I could look into that more if you're curious later. Yeah. Yes?
Maybe I'm looking too much for a how-to book, but aside from your mentioning holding your heart with your hands, I'm not sure how to go about this, receiving or giving myself more self-compassion.
Oh, well, isn't that handy? No, I joke, but no, I'm serious. Every chapter has several exercises. So, I mean, obviously, it's not just a good idea. And I didn't actually talk about it in this talk, but I finished developing an 8-week workshop to teach these skills, or I teach week-long intensives where we help people practice the skill of self-compassion. It's not like you can just say, oh, good idea, and snap your fingers and you got it. You have to practice it, learn new habits. But I do have lots of exercises in the book. Some of them are meditations, and you can listen to the meditations on my website. I've got guided versions. Not everyone's into meditation, so there's other exercises. So, for example, most people are pretty good at being compassionate to others. They've really developed that skill. So one trick is to always continually draw on the skill you have, which is how to be compassionate to others, and apply it to yourself. So for instance, let's say you're really beating yourself up about some mistake you made and you're feeling horrible. You can imagine, what if a very dear friend was going through that same situation? Write that friend a letter. What would you say to that friend if you wanted to express your deep compassion, care, and concern? Write it out, set it down for a little while, and come back and read the letter. Right? That's one thing you can do. I've got lots of exercises like that in the book. And that would be a whole other talk. It's Berkeley. I'll probably end up doing a workshop at some point or another. But yeah, I mean, it's a very good question. But I tried to make the book as practical as possible. Yeah. Thanks for the plug. Yeah.
You didn't specifically mention it, but it strikes me this is particularly relevant to people going through a grieving process. That they've lost someone because you have regrets and what did I do, et cetera, et cetera. And that's a time when this could be particularly useful. I know it's really useful to me.
Yeah, so hopefully everyone heard that, but just that this is especially important in the grieving process. And I would say, absolutely. I know certainly, a lot of therapists teach this to their clients. In fact, you might even say one of the markers of a good therapist is they would help someone get through maybe a grief situation with self-compassion. So it's not like this is radically different, but it's really just kind of making it concrete how you can what you can actually give yourself in those moments. So I think you're absolutely right. I mean, as a matter of fact, I can think of just dozens of situations in which we need self-compassion. Just going to the supermarket. But I think you're right. Absolutely.
Moments of crisis.
Moments of crisis.
That's when you need it most.
Yeah, and it's funny. I know in my own life, and my friends can attest to this. I'll lose it over the little things. Like it's just like, oh, I'm late for work or something. I'll let myself get really stressed. But if it's important, I take it seriously. So in a way, having a real crisis might be what you need to say, okay, I really need to take this seriously and give myself compassion and figure out how to deal with this. I just can't let myself react as usual because it's just too devastating if I do. So thank you for that. Yes, gentleman in back.
Is it possible to have high self-esteem and a high self-compassion at the same time, or is it mutually exclusive?
No, it's a very good question. So in fact, and I didn't go into that because the storyline's kind of neater this way, but in fact, high self-esteem and high self-compassion do go hand in hand. So in other words, if you care about yourself and you treat yourself kindly, you'll feel a sense of self-worth. And if you hate yourself and beat yourself up, you'll feel a lack of self-worth. The difference is, you might say what type of self-esteem it is. Self-esteem can be, I'm a narcissist, I'm Donald Trump, I have high self-esteem. Or it can be, you know, I really believe in myself as a human being, I'm worthy of respect, it's unconditional. So when we do research, what we do is we have a way of kind of distinguishing the part of self-esteem that's more narcissistic, that's self-focused versus just feeling, you know, worthy because you're human and because you have self-compassion. And interestingly, self-compassion explains all the things like less anxiety when you feel self-conscious. It's not at all associated with narcissism the way self-esteem is. People are less ego-defensive. They compare themselves to others. Their sense of self-worth is much more stable. So the problem with self-esteem is just that it's too broad a concept. You know, it can mean I'm authentically happy and worthy as a human being on this planet, or it can mean, again, Donald Trump. And you don't really know the difference. So I think that's why psychologists are moving away from self-esteem. It's too general, and starting to look at why do you feel good about yourself or not feel good about yourself? And that seems to be a little more useful. Does that make sense? So the answer is yes, you can have both, but the type of the type of self-esteem you have is healthier.
I love being told, Annika, you got it.
I think the term self-criticality has got a bad reputation. There's such a thing as responsible self-criticism. And my view of that is that you can be legitimately self-critical if you're self-judgmental without being self-punitive. And that's an important distinction.
Yeah, it's a very good point. I actually go into this a bit in my book because you know, these are all words, right? So from the Buddhist tradition, they talk about judgment versus wise discernment, okay? So, you know, the word judgment can mean wise discernment. I clearly see what's healthy, what's unhealthy, what's a good action, what's a bad action. Or it can mean, you know, you lousy, lazy, worthless piece of you know what, right? So it can have a very harsh, punitive tone, that's a good word, or just a tone of seeing clearly what's healthy or not. So self-compassion actually increases the ability to have wise discernment towards yourself, to see yourself clearly, to clearly see this isn't working, or this was harmful, or this pattern of behavior is, you know, unhealthy for me. So it's not, you know, again, it's language. So you might say critic in the sense of, I don't know, Roger Ebert or something like, you know, a really good intellectual understanding of what's going on, absolutely. But you can see what's wrong and where you need to make a change without beating yourself up in a very harsh, punitive way. But yeah, absolutely. If we didn't have that type of judgment, we'd be lost.
Yes.
You mentioned that often, or at least sometimes, self-critical people find partners who fulfill their self-criticism. Might not people be their own self-critical partners as well? I'm no good, I screw up, so I'll screw up. I'll procrastinate, I'll screw up in other ways. Fulfilling your view of yourself, at least you're comfortable. You know the roadmap, at least you know where you are.
Yes, so the point was sometimes if you're really self-critical, aren't you comfortable that way? Don't you actually prefer to be that way? There's actually Bill Swan, who's at UT Austin with me, has something called self-verification theory, where he finds that people with low self-esteem who don't like themselves, they actually don't like it when others like them. They feel uncomfortable if they receive a compliment or someone treats them in a way they don't feel, you know, used to, and that they're actually more comfortable with the devil they know. And they're thrown off kilter by someone treating them in a new way, which means it can be a very, you know, pernicious cycle. It's hard to break out of if you feel scared or uncomfortable by someone treating you the way you actually do deserve to be treated, but you don't think you deserve to be treated that way. So yeah, that's absolutely true. That's supported by research. Yeah.
I guess that brings up, at what point does that bring in enough cognitive dissonance to break the cycle? That's probably an empirical question in any given case.
Yeah, well, it's such a good question. You know, what makes you finally say enough is enough?
Yes.
You know, and I can't answer that. You can, yeah, you know, it just sometimes seems it just happens. I do think, however, that when our culture supports the idea that you have permission to take another way with yourself, it really helps. You know, knowing that it is an option. I think a lot of people don't even know that self-compassion is an option, that it's one of the, you know, menu choices. And I think when you do know that there is another way, and that it's not going to mean you're lazy and self-indulgent and just let yourself get away with anything, then that makes that, maybe that makes that breaking point to come a little sooner. But yeah, it's really, I don't know why, it's very interesting.
Anything else?
I'm trying to think in my head, and I'm having a hard time, so I thought maybe you can maybe verbalize it, but some of the aspects seem to remind me of the teachings about forgiveness and self-forgiveness, but I can't really kind of get clear on my head about what the difference is.
Oh, how this is different than self-forgiveness? Yeah. Right. So they certainly overlap quite a lot, and you wouldn't be shocked to know that people who are high in self-compassion are also high in self-forgiveness. It's really more that self-forgiveness, especially the way it's been, you know, defined, is more about forgiving yourself for a transgression. It's just more specific. So you made a transgression. Can you forgive yourself for doing it? Self-compassion is just broader. It might be that you've done something wrong. It might be that you aren't as sin as you want to be. It might be that you got rejected by someone. I mean, it's just a much broader construct. Also, the thing I think that's different with self-compassion and maybe some things like self-forgiveness or self-acceptance is that common humanity piece. I think it's so key. All these self-terms, self-love, self-acceptance, etc., they have the possibility of becoming egocentric and self-focused if you aren't careful. You know, self-love, self-acceptance. It's not really necessarily taking other people into account in the picture. Self-compassion, by definition, means always framing things as the shared human experience, and I think that's an important distinction. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Yes. I understand you're creating a 8-week training course. I wonder if you could talk about that, what that will entail.
Yeah, so we've created a course. I don't know if any of you are familiar with mindfulness-based stress reduction, but it's the most commonly used course to teach mindfulness, how to be in the present moment and stay with your breath and not to lose yourself in reactivity. So we've created an 8-week course called Mindful Self-Compassion, which really focuses extensively on teaching self-compassion skills. Again, through exercises. We have interactive exercises in our workshops, meditations. We just, like 2 weeks ago, collected our first data looking at a control group who are waiting for the course but hadn't taken it yet versus one who just took the course. So in a few weeks, I'll have data that hopefully shows that it worked. And then we're planning to write up the manual for the program and then start more formal teacher trainings, and it's poised to take off. We're just getting it solidified now. So, but we do teach workshops. We're teaching one at Esalen in February. If any of you, it's, oh gosh, Esalen. Just talk about self-compassion. That's self-indulgence. I don't know. That's pretty good. Esalen. We're teaching one at Kripalu and Omega. And then my colleague, especially Chris Germer, teaches a lot of weekend workshops. So if you go to my website, if you're interested in taking a workshop, or just email me, I can get you that information. And we probably should wrap it up so we don't keep everyone, but I'm going to be around here signing books, and then also if you didn't get to ask a question, please feel free and come ask me afterwards. All right?
Thank you so much.
All right, thank you so much for showing up.
To recommend it.
Yeah, some people told me that they're using a cleanse and thought it would be one chapter or something. And going through, well, I think it becomes very clients, but I tried to write it in a very accessible way.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And
See the world through other people's eyes. Now, empathy is a quality of character that can change the world.